Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be going over all the books that I read for Victober. So this is my October wrap-up part 2. So for Victober, I managed to read 6 books and I'm halfway through a 7th. So I didn't quite manage to finish it before the end of October, but that's completely okay. I'll definitely finish it today. If not today, tomorrow, but I have a feeling I'll finish it today. It's just so good. And I'll actually mention this book first, and that is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I just reached the halfway point. I'm loving this book so much. This is definitely on its way to becoming a favorite classic, a favorite Victorian classic. Just amazing. I love this book so much. There's so much intrigue and mystery and just so good. And I just can't wait to finish it and gush about it in my November wrap-up. So I guess you'll have to wait and hear more of my thoughts until then, but loving this book. So moving on to all of the books that I did finish. First off, I want to mention The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain by Charles Dickens. This was a short Christmas story. I would say the story is very different from A Christmas Carol, but at the beginning we have this main character who is a professor and he's visited by this ghost. And so that's, I guess, the one similarity with A Christmas Carol is both characters are visited by a ghost and there's a purpose behind it. This ghost kind of takes them on a journey. So in this book, we have this ghost visiting the professor, and basically this ghost offers to erase the professor's memories because of his painful past. And there are many consequences that arise because of, I guess, his forgetting of his past. And one of those consequences is that he becomes emotionless. And so the story kind of goes from there. The character learns the importance of memory, and that's basically the story. I didn't really like it all that much. I think I gave it 3 stars. I've been having a massive love-hate relationship with Dickens because there are many things about his writing and there are many things about his books that I love. And then there are things that drive me insane. One of those things is when he has numerous run-on sentences. It's just run-on sentence after run-on sentence. And like I have to find the period of that sentence and then I kind of pace myself slowly to figure out what on earth he's trying to say because I just can't always follow. With this one, the writing was really nice, but he can over describe things as well. And it's too much sometimes. And that takes me out of the narrative. So with this story, that's kind of what happened. I think it was okay, but nowhere near as amazing as A Christmas Carol. I also read a poetry collection, and I'm pretty sure that Amy from Amy of Hearthridge recommended this poetry collection. So thank you so much for that recommendation. I overall really enjoyed it. I didn't give it a rating though, and I just kind of feel weird rating a poetry collection when not all of the poetry in that collection is, I guess, for me. I kind of feel weird rating a poetry collection. So unless it's a collection that blows me away that I'm absolutely in love with, I can 100% give it a 5 stars. But when it's not quite there, I just kind of take what I can understand from the poetry and try to, I guess, just get as much as I can out of those poems. And so this poetry collection, The Diary of an Old Soul, it's written by George MacDonald, and each poem is basically like a prayer, and he is addressing God when he writes each of these poems. A lot of the poetry was beautiful. It is basically a poem a day from January 1st up until December 31st. So over the course of a year, so there are 365, I think 366 actually, but there are poems for each day of the year. And a lot of the times the next day's poem will build off of the previous one. And it has a beautiful flow. I will say that. It's a beautifully written poetry collection. The only thing is I'm not huge on poetry. Some of them I didn't really understand, and that's just because I don't read a lot of poetry, but some of them were very beautifully written. And one of them I wanted to read because I really liked it. And it goes, "It must be possible that the soul made should absolutely meet the soul that makes. Then in that bearing soul meet every other, there also born, each sister and each brother. Lord, till I meet thee thus, life is delayed. I am not I until that morning breaks. Not I until my consciousness eternal wakes." And so a lot of the poems were kind of in a similar vein where he is thinking about what heaven will be like and how it compares to life on earth. And I thought that was really nice. So overall, really enjoyed this collection. This next book that I'm going to be talking about, it breaks my heart because I was expecting it to be a 5-star read. I thought I would love it, and I only gave it 3 stars. I do have to say though that when I rate books, it's much more based on how I feel about it rather than an analysis of the story, and it's very much based on my emotional reactions to the story. more than any analytical perspectives or anything like that. So because of that, this book is a 3 stars. I don't think it's a terrible book. In fact, I think the author is an amazing author. I do think that I will find a book by him that I will give 5 stars. It's just the content, the story itself was just not that interesting for me. And I'm talking about Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. So this is book 2 in the Barchester series, and the first book, The Warden, I have read twice now. The first time I read it, I gave it 3 stars. The second time I read it, I gave it 4 stars. So I did enjoy it much more my second time around, and that might happen with this book as well. I'm hoping it does, that if I reread it, I like it even more. With The Warden, it is much shorter, and it deals with church politics, which is one of the reasons that I didn't enjoy it as much. But with the second read through the book, I found that I was much more attached to the characters, and so I'm hoping that's the case with this one. Because in this one, the church politics are just as intense in my opinion. There are some very, very interesting characters in this. We have a new bishop named Mr. Prouty and his wife, and she was quite entertaining. I will say she was very, very entertaining. We have a very icky man named Mr. Slope, and he's a new chaplain. And so we're introduced to all these characters, and many of them are very interesting, and I like how Anthony Trollope describes them. I like how he introduced each character to the story. We have the Stanhope family who move back to England. They were living in Italy, but before that they were living in England. So they're back, and they also have 3 children who are all very fascinating. One of them is this woman who is probably one of the biggest flirts I've ever seen in a Victorian classic. So overall, very interesting characters, and that is one thing that I did really like about the story. The characters were interesting, but the plot was very slow moving for my personal tastes. There were many moments where I was so bored, and it was very, very low lows and very high highs for me. The moments that I enjoyed, the moments that I found funny were very enjoyable and very funny, but when I was bored, I was very bored. And I feel so bad because I know that so many people just adore this book and find it amazing. And like, objectively speaking, I think it's a great book. I just struggled so much to connect to it and to want to keep reading. There's also a romance in this book, and when the romance kind of comes to a head towards the end of the story, I just didn't really care because, in my opinion, there wasn't enough development, and it was just kind of there, and I just wasn't convinced that the romance works and that it's a good match, if that makes sense. I am so sorry if any of you are watching and you adore this book. I don't know why, I just wasn't as invested. It's great writing, great storytelling, good characters, but the plot just did not draw me in. So next up we have the group read, which was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, and this one I gave 3.5 stars. I overall enjoyed it. I went in with very low expectations, so I definitely enjoyed it more than I was expecting. The only other Hardy book that I've read was Far From the Madding Crowd, and for some reason, this one was so much easier to understand. I don't know, maybe it's because Far From the Madding Crowd was a classic I read a little earlier on in my classics journey, I guess, but this one was much easier. I almost felt like it was a different author, much more accessible and not as heavy-handed with the descriptions, which I think I like. So I don't think there's much I can say about this story without spoiling a lot of what happens, but the main thing that occurs that kind of sets the course for the rest of the story and for these characters' lives is this man named Michael Henchard sells his wife and baby. Just sells them. And that is the main thing that occurs at the beginning of the book, and so many things happen after that. Michael becomes a mayor in this new town, and he's definitely hiding the fact that he has a wife and daughter who are now under the guardianship of another man. And so the majority of the story is Michael Henchard dealing with this guilt and then starting on this path of self-destruction, and it's not a pleasant story. I really enjoyed the side characters in this book, and I was definitely rooting more for them than for Mr. Henchard. And the thing with Mr. Henchard is he just kept making choices that would make things even more difficult and make his downward spiral even worse, and just decision after decision that just drove me insane, made me so angry. One minute I'm thinking, okay, the man has a heart. The next minute I'm like, really? It baffled my mind. And I think that Thomas Hardy wrote a very good story. Like, I think that the story is great. One thing that I will say, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but I just wish that there was more hope, and I kind of wanted the ending to be a little different, but overall I really enjoyed it. I gave it 3.5 stars, and I'm glad that this was the group read because I'm a lot less scared to read more Thomas Hardy now. Far from the Madding Crowd definitely terrified me of trying out his other books because that was hard for me to get through. But this one was definitely an easier read, and I am looking forward to trying out another one by him, so a pretty good read. Next up, we have a book that I gave 4 stars to, and the other book by this author that most people love, I didn't give 4 stars to. I didn't even give 5 stars to. I gave it 3.5. The book that I'm talking about right now is Villette by Charlotte Bronte. And Jane Eyre is the more popular book by this author that usually gets a lot more love. But I liked this one more, which I know I am definitely in the minority. But I just think this book had a much more mature main character, and while the pacing was a little slow and not always the way I like it, I still think that the story was more interesting than Jane Eyre. While reading Jane Eyre, I was just in a constant state of, I can't stand Mr. Rochester, like I need to get out of this story. I couldn't stand Mr. Rochester, and that's why I didn't like Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre as a character is a great character. The writing was great, the atmosphere was great. But the main character in this book, I liked more. She was a lot more mature, less naive. I don't necessarily think this is a better book, but I just enjoyed my time reading it more. So at the beginning of this book, we have a young teenage girl named Lucy Snow, and she is living with her god family. And she's basically, I assume, orphaned because not much is told about her past. It's very, very mysterious. So she's living with her god family. And then as she's growing older, she kind of has to jump from job to job. Nothing really lasts for her until she finds herself a teacher in a town in France called Villette. It's probably not pronounced that way, but either way, Lucy ends up in Villette, and there she is teaching at this boarding school for girls. And there she meets some of my favorite characters ever, one of them being Dr. John and the other one being a teacher who is French and has a very harsh personality, but you can tell deep down he has a really good heart, and his name is Paul. And just such interesting character dynamics in this story, I have to say. At the beginning, you don't really understand Lucy as a character. Like, you don't really get in her brain, in her head, and she feels like an enigma. Like, she just doesn't feel well fleshed out. But as the story progresses, you get more and more into her mindset, into her thoughts and her feelings, and you learn more about her and like the depths of her personality. And I feel like Charlotte Bronte did an amazing job characterizing Lucy. Another thing I will say is the character of Paul. He is so easy to hate, but also easy to love. And I think that his character was just brilliant. I loved him so, so much. And I think my favorite part of the story was actually the romance. And I can't say anything because it will spoil the ending. But what Charlotte Bronte chose to do with the romance is very different, and the way that she chose to end the story is also different. But I loved it. I think it was so, so good. So again, I will not say whether this book is better than Jane Eyre or Jane Eyre is better than this book. I don't really think I could even make a kind of claim like that, but I did enjoy this one more. Just me personally, as a reader, I thought this one was great. And I would recommend. It's just a bit slower, but I really, really liked it a lot. All right, so the last book that I want to talk about, and this is the only 5-star that I read for Victober, and that is Poor Miss Finch by Wilkie Collins. I buddy read this with Janelle, and I think the buddy read experience was one of my favorites that I've ever had. I just love buddy reading. It just casts a different light on the story when you're discussing it with someone else, hearing their thoughts. And the best feeling is when you feel the exact same. It's just such a good feeling, especially when you're both loving a book. And I know Janelle adored this book. I adored it as well. We just had such a good time with it. I initially gave it 4 stars, but it's one of those books that the further away I get from it, the more I love it. So I bumped it up to a 5. It deserves a 5 stars. I know it's not one of Wilkie Collins' best. It's definitely one of his lower rated books, especially when you look on Goodreads. It's not considered one of his best, but I loved it so, so much. I think this book has some of the most interesting characters, some of the funniest scenes, and just laugh out loud moments. It's just amazing. I loved this book so much. So we have a woman named Madame Pratolungo, and she is a French woman who has recently lost her husband, and she's looking for a job, and she answers an advertisement for a lady's maid for a blind girl named Lucilla Finch. And so she becomes her, I guess, companion more than like a maid, and really gets involved in Lucilla and her romance and her family life and just everything about Lucilla's life. Madame Pratolungo is just kind of thrown into it. One of my favorite moments was actually when Madame Pratolungo first starts helping Lucilla out, and she offers her arm to help Lucilla walk. And Lucilla just laughs in her face because she is so used to being blind. She knows how to get around, and she kind of scoffs and is like, I think I know my own place, my own house better than you. And it was such an interesting dynamic between the two of them. And I have to say, Madame Pradolungo is probably one of my favorite characters of all time. This woman was hilarious, just hilarious, so headstrong, so opinionated, but so sensitive to the needs of others, and just so full of kindness at the same time, and a sense of justice. And she was just a beautiful character. I loved her so, so much. The main conflict of this book stems from the fact that Lucilla falls in love with a man named Oscar. Then Oscar's brother enters the picture, and he falls in love with Lucilla. And because of her blindness, Oscar's brother Nugent is able to worm his way into Lucilla's life and take Oscar's place, which is awful. And the story kind of goes from there. I don't want to say anything else because I don't want to spoil it. But this book was just such a fun ride. I could not put it down. Every time I picked it up, I couldn't stop reading. I loved it so, so much. Part of this book did slog a little bit for me, but the way that Wilkie Collins writes, the way he portrays his characters, I love it so much. So if you're looking for something very charming but melodramatic with awesome characters and just funny moments, with some sad moments as well, this is perfect. Also, the ending was perfect in my opinion. Such a good book. All right, everyone. So those are all the books that I read for Victober. Please let me know in the comments if you also participated in Victober and what you read for this readathon. I had a really, really great time with the majority of the books that I read. And that's it for this video. Thank you all so, so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in my next one. Bye!